Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, in order to honor our veterans, we'll be talking with Mark Lee Greenblatt, who is the author of the marvelous book Valor. It's about unsung heroes from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the home front. Mark is an attorney based in the Washington, D.C. area, specializing in criminal ethics investigations, and over the course of his career, he has led investigations into criminal ethics misconduct by senior officials in the U.S. He has also been a litigator for two large international law firms and a law clerk for a federal district judge, and he's also been a ghostwriter and an op-ed contributor to such papers as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, author of the book Valor, Mark Lee Greenblatt. Mark, how are you today?
Doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, I'm taking a look at your credentials here, and I'm thinking, okay, how do we stretch from going after abuses to talking about unsung heroes? That seems kind of an interesting contrast in some ways.
Well, absolutely. I think that was one thing that was so motivating about this project is that I spent my career essentially investigating, ethical lapses, misconduct, waste, fraud, and abuse in government affairs, which is bad human conduct, the worst in human behavior, certainly by public officials. And that's why this book was so attractive to me, was that I was inspired by these stories, and so writing them was a great juxtaposition because it was writing about positive stories. It was about the best of the human behavior, and so that was really what gripped me.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know each of these stories are very unique in how they stand out for the motivations of why these people joined the particular branch of service that they did, but also for what they've contributed. And the first one that comes to mind for me was the captain who actually, I found this interesting. He donates money to families in Afghanistan. He doesn't say who the money's coming from, nor does he know where the money's going. And he's done this thousands of dollars over the years. And you think, what kind of clicks people when they're in a war-torn country like that? They want to kind of get out of it and probably not even look back on it. But it's actually with them for the rest of their lives. Tell us about him.
Absolutely. You're talking about Mike Waltz, an Army Special Forces reserve officer who was leading a unit in a remote valley in Afghanistan. And he was partnered with an Afghan unit, and he grew to like and admire the Afghan sergeant major of that unit. And he really liked this guy and thought that's what Afghanistan needs, is this kind of guy, hardworking, diligent, dedicated to making Afghanistan a better place. And during the incident in which Mike earned a Bronze Star with Valor, that Afghan was gunned down in this ambush by insurgents in this Afghan village, and Mike ran into the crossfire to try to save the man's life, dragging him back to this one little area that was surrounded by trees, and tried to save his life. And the man died in his arms. Mm. And Mike pledged. He had a long conversation with the guy the day prior about why he joined the Afghan military, and he said it was to give his kids a better life. And when Mike, the man died in his arms, and Mike later learned that his wife was so poor that she had to send their kids to the fundamentalist madrasas, where they would get radicalized. Mike pledged that he was going to support that family so they didn't have to send those sons to those schools. Mm-hmm. And he devised a way to donate money, his own hard-earned money, to that family. And then he later learned that because of his contributions, they were able to pull those kids from the madrasas. And Mike is, just so committed to making Afghanistan a better place and keeping that family going that he really dedicated a huge amount of time and money to do that. And it's really just an inspiring story.
Mm-hmm. And furthermore, he has, as I used the word contrast earlier in the program, is here was a guy on the front lines, but at the same time he also served in Washington, mixing with top brass there, especially on the Afghan dilemma when it comes to the opium trade.
That's right. Mike is really an interesting guy on so many different levels, and that's one of them. I tried to capture that in his chapter, his profile, that he was at these two different levels. He was a commander on the ground doing patrols, special forces patrols in the darkest areas of Afghanistan, but at the same time he was walking the halls of the Pentagon at the various highest meetings. At one point he was an advisor, a very senior advisor to Vice President Cheney on Afghan affairs. Prior to that, as you said, he was leading up the anti-narcotics effort for the Pentagon in Afghanistan. I mean, just incredibly senior, high-level involvement by Mike, but he was also on the ground at the same time. I mean, it was a really interesting combination, and he's just a fascinating guy to talk to. I mean, they talk about, his men told me how he would have, Financial Times and The Economist out in the field because he wanted to stay up on the latest information. It's pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you come to decide on these people that you feature here in the book Valor?
Well, there's one common theme amongst these 9 profiles, and what it is that in each of them, there was a moment where they're in these incidents where there is just dire circumstances. But in each of those stories, there's a moment where they're in relative safety. The bullets aren't actually being fired at them at that moment. And each of these guys makes a conscious decision, or at least an instinctive decision, to go into harm's way in order to accomplish a mission or save a life. And that fascinated me, that moment where they didn't have to go into that, into the crossfire. They didn't have to jump out of the helicopter or whatever it was that they did. They didn't have to stay in or go into sniper's fire to save a buddy. But they all did. And that fascinated me. And I needed to learn what was going on in their mind when they made that choice. I just had to crawl in their body, and this is what I tried to do for the readers, is put the readers in their body in that moment. And what are they doing? What are they thinking? Why are they making that decision? Because that just was so compelling to me that I wanted to convey that to the readers.
Well, you certainly had a lot of clarity when you were describing one James Hassel, U.S. Marine Corps infantryman.
Yes. James, another fascinating guy, and he made a promise to his mother. His mother was furious when he enlisted in the Marine Corps, and he made a promise to his mother that the only thing that would mollify her was that he promised he would come back from Iraq in one piece. And fast forward, he's in a nasty, nasty firefight in Najaf, and one of his comrades takes shrapnel from a grenade. A guy named Ryan, and Ryan was injured pretty badly, and they all understood that he was going to die unless someone got him to the medevac helicopter, which is about 100 yards away. Problem was that the insurgents were firing into the alley where that evacuation would have to take place, and despite that, James raised his hand without hesitation and said, "Throw him on my back." That's what he said. "Throw him on my back." And they did. They threw Ryan on James's back, and James, as he's about to run out into this crossfire, trying to save Ryan's life, he thinks back to the promise to his mother, and he says to himself, I think I'm about to break that promise." Mm-hmm. And then he runs out into the crossfire. Just a fascinating moment, again, of what's going on in his mind. And basically it was, I can't leave Ryan behind. I can't let him die. It was just a fascinating moment to me, and so I tried to convey that in James's profile.
Well, and the biggest thing for people to understand is that he was at a decision gate where, okay, I could live, but then I have to live with the fact that he'll die and I could have done something. That at least if I possibly die, then at least I've died trying to do something. And people need to understand, I think, for instance, when it comes to the Marine Corps, what the training and the thinking behind that thinking really is. I'd like you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Right. Well, you hit on it exactly. I mean, there is a brotherhood instilled in them that drives that thinking of, I can't leave him behind. Even though I may die, I know that if I don't try, he will die. And it's just fascinating to me that the way James described it was that the fear instilled in all of them, in him and all the guys, was not dying. It was not dying. The fear was doing something that caused another Marine to die. And that was a fascinating concept to me. And I don't know that we in the civilian world can really appreciate it, but these guys live it and breathe it, and it means everything to them. One of them, a Navy SEAL named Chris Kyle, he described it with a slightly different veneer, but he said, I'd rather die than live on with knowing that I could have tried to help someone and they died, and live with a coward's conscience. That's how he described it, coward's conscience, for the rest of my life. And I found that to be a fascinating concept. And they each had a slightly different way of framing it, but it conveyed that same type of concept that you were just talking about. It's just the dedication to each other is just overwhelming.
And you got to think, and this is above and beyond war, when you consider these individuals that decide to commit themselves to our country for the protection and the freedoms of our country, and they end up stuck in wars that we just don't agree with, and it really stinks. Now, I've served myself in the United States Navy, and it's the attitude sometimes that I think what we really learned, for instance, from Vietnam was this: you can't sit there and start pointing your fingers at our troops. They were just doing what they were told to do. Maybe some of them were pretty unethical. That's just going to happen. But the fact is, you can't turn your back on a situation that others have put them into. They need to feel supported. I think the worst part of serving in the United States military, especially if you have combat experiences, to come back realizing that you've been forgotten about, that somehow you're not appreciated for what you've done in service to your country. And and I've seen it actually happen. I mean, the suicides are quite high from this particular war that's going on now for more than 10 years, that it's like they come back and they're ghosts. They've come back to a society that, okay, well, we're going to go about our day. And that's not an easy thing to reintegrate back into. You can see why they would just rather be back there doing that instead.
Absolutely. That was one of the primary motivations for me to write Valor, was just the very concept that you're talking about. You think back to war heroes of previous generations like Audie Murphy or Sergeant York, and they were household names.
Right.
Communities had ticker tape parades for them. And I think we lost that along the way here over the last 10 or so years. And that was really the inspiration for writing this book, was to show, what these men and women are doing over there, and to, convey that we need to understand what they're doing, appreciate what they're doing, and say thank you, frankly. And that was really what, Valor is all about.
I think one of the things, though, it did bring tears to my eyes was James Hassel. He ends up coming back to the United States, and at the age of 30, he dies. You think he's been for all this, but he's finally got himself to probably the most respected place a person can feel they can be in, which is into the brotherhood, as you mentioned earlier, but also having the respect of seniors, within his group, where you're finally now in the tribe. And that's a heck of a place for a person to find themselves.
Absolutely. James, his passing was just awful. It hurts me now. I get a little choked up whenever I think about it. It was just tragic. His transformation from a young, brash kid in Birmingham, he's
cocky
a funny
as well.
story. Very cocky, cocky, very brash, outspoken, funny, but cocky. He talks about how we went out on the first day that he was playing football, and he walked around the field like he was Tom Brady, and so there's this sort of rakish cockiness to him, but how he evolved into this team player, this guy who is all about selflessness, about dedication to the higher mission, is just such an overwhelming transformation. He talks about how He understands. His personal philosophy became being part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that was his mission in life, and it was just a wonderful evolution. And when he came home, he had a little trouble coming back, and he was homeless at one point. He was facing some real dire problems, but he was really turning his life around. He had gotten a degree, and he had gotten a job, and he was married with a 4-year-old daughter. I mean, he was doing great, and then he just had this tragic heart attack. He just collapsed in his kitchen. It was last Labor Day, and they tried to keep him alive, but he didn't survive after a couple of days, and it's just awful. Just an awful pit in my stomach. And you can only imagine what his family and friends have gone through over the last several months. I mean, I've talked with family members, and it's just a tragic story.
I think what's even more tragic when you take a look at the whole thing, too, again, getting back to these heroes, and this goes for all the people that serve in the United States military who get put in harm's way and perhaps become harmed, disabled, whatever may happen. And they come back here, and all of a sudden they're getting benefits and a lot of things cut off. And I take a look at, for instance, your credentials, and I see that, that you have been somebody who has actually led investigations into criminal ethical misconduct by senior officials in the U.S. and the foreign governments, homeland security vulnerability, and so forth. And I wonder, what is the thinking behind these people in the Senate body that make these decisions to cut these people off after service the way that they do?
Yeah, well, I should mention that this is separate from my day job, writing the book. And that
I just figured because you're kind of in there, if you had some insight on the thing, because you put a book together like this. To me, it would change the way you view our government runs and support or lack thereof of our veterans.
Absolutely, hearing their stories. I mean, one of the guys is an Army guy named Dan Foster, who earned a Silver Star for unbelievable conduct in an awful ambush. He was facing foreclosure because the VA had screwed up his benefits when he came home. He was living in California, still is, and they sent his paperwork to North Carolina. And so for a long time, Dan had no benefits whatsoever. He was facing foreclosure, having real trouble. And only when a veterans organization called Veterans First in Orange County stepped in and helped him navigate the system and get it corrected, was he able to kind of get back on track. And but it shouldn't come to that, and that's a travesty. And that's one of the things that I was hoping to personalize some of these so that people would get angry. It's not just statistics; it's that they know a guy like Dan Foster who did X, Y, and Z, did amazing things, earned a Silver Star. Which is incredibly high in the military hierarchy of commendations, to have him come home to such a raw deal by the VA is very troubling. So I really was hoping to change the narrative a little bit and give some real people who are facing these consequences. Now, in terms of talking about how folks make those decisions, I think there's a bit of a disconnect, frankly, between a wide swath of America and the military, that people just don't know, like back in World War II, say, where everyone knew folks that had gone over and served. I think we have a big disconnect in many ways where we don't have that sort of personal, familiar connection to folks who served, and therefore, it's easy to cut when you don't have a name or a face to go with the statistics.
Mm-hmm. Now, the only pilot that you do feature in here was a pretty interesting story in and of itself. He's a Navy rescue swimmer as well. Tell us about Mr. Kyle Need.
Yeah, Kyle, it's a fascinating story. He was a rescue swimmer, as you said, which is, for folks who may not know what that is, those are the guys who jump out of the helicopters into open water to save someone who may be out in need. And in this case, it was a horrific storm. And Kyle was part of a unit on the USS Eisenhower, a big aircraft carrier that was deploying out to go to the Middle East. And as they came across the Atlantic on their first night, actually, of their deployment, they got a call of a shipwrecked civilian a few hundred miles in the Atlantic. And it was in the middle of this horrific storm. Just to give you a sense of how bad the storm was, Kyle said it wasn't just the worst storm that he had ever done a mission in. It was the worst storm he had ever been in. And another, the pilot, Commander Ogden, who was flying the helicopter that night, and, he had flown thousands and thousands of hours in helicopters over the years, thousands. He said this was by far the worst, most horrific storm he had ever flown in. They had swells, waves of 50 feet high. Think about that. That's 5 stories high. And Kyle, they found this shipwrecked civilian, in the middle of the Atlantic amidst this swirl of horrific weather. And Kyle went right in into this dark, it was in the middle of the night, it was dark, swirling sea, winds flying around, snow caked on his face mask, and he went down and grabbed the civilian who was on this life raft, clinging desperately, and he grabbed him and they hoisted him back up, and Kyle literally saved his life that night. Just a pretty inspiring story.
Well, I know I've been out on that Atlantic when it's been ugly. 50 feet, that was a baby wave. But still, it's still pretty bad out there.
They described it. They said it was so bad that it was literally rocking the aircraft carrier. I mean, you know how big an aircraft carrier is. I mean, it's like a hotel. I mean, it's enormous. And this thing was getting tossed around. They said that's how bad the storm was. Pretty amazing.
I can imagine. Now, what has been the response to your book, Valor, as it's been out there for people?
Folks have loved it. I think that there's a hunger in America for positive stories like this of what our folks are doing overseas, what the men and women in uniform are doing. And so I think the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and that's been really invigorating for me, frankly. I always had this sense that people wanted these stories, but just to hear back from folks that are just so happy, I think people conceptualize, they know on some sort of intellectual level what our men and women are doing, but they don't necessarily know on a granular level. And that was what that was the void I was trying to fill, was having names and faces and actual real moments. So that people could say, I understand what they're doing. And that's one of the things I liked, is that it's a variety of different types of men doing different types of things. Like you said, Kyle Need is a rescue swimmer, and then we have urban fighting in Iraq and rural fighting in Afghanistan, and we have a pilot, and we have special forces commander. So it's a different type of thing. So it's, trying to capture all of the different types of men and women doing things in uniform, so that people have a real face that they can put with some of these stories. So they as I said, just a granular understanding of what they're doing.
Now I got a question, Mark. When you were interviewing these people, and did you meet with each of these people face to face as you put this book together?
I didn't actually. Okay. Some of them were deployed, so it was over the phone. One of them was via Skype, and some of them were, mostly phone. Some of them were in person. A couple of them were in person. Just a variety of different ways. It was hard when they were in Afghanistan or Iraq to hold these, extended interviews. One of them I interviewed for 8 hours while he was in Baghdad. Another one I did a Skype call with at several hours while he was in Afghanistan. So we made it work, but there was a variety of different ways that I conducted the interviews.
Now, the reason I was asking that question is you kind of feel a sense of up close and personal. It's obvious when you write what you write about each of these unique individuals, but I wondered if there was a theme running through any of them that they may have expressed to you about what they hope coming back home will be like, what will make them feel comfortable in light of what they've experienced.
Well, one of them, Buck Doyle, he was a gunnery sergeant. He was the first
one that came to mind, actually. I thought this guy would be really cool to have as a next-door neighbor and actually create a good friendship out of. But anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, if there's, if I were in a dark alley and I didn't feel safe, I would want Buck Doyle standing next to me. He is a hard, dedicated, committed man, and if there's anyone that would make me feel safer, it's Buck Doyle. But Buck, he said it best, I think. I think all of them conveyed this, but Buck said it best. And I think what it is understanding what they're doing, understanding what they're going through, so that when they come home, people can be a little bit more sensitive to, what their needs are, to easing their transition back. But that was the word that Buck used, and they all had that same flavor, which was understanding, appreciating, what the daily life is like, and appreciating what it's like when buddies that you love die or get injured. That's something that's scarring, especially for the younger guys. A guy like James Hassel, who was, a young guy, seeing friends killed right next to him, and or a guy like Ryan, who was grievously injured. It scars them a little bit, and I think they need help coming back. And I think that's the foundation that they're looking for, is that understanding the appreciation of their circumstances over there.
Well, we're just all very happy that you've been able to profile these people here, our unsung heroes, as you say on the subtitle of your book, to remind us that these are people. They could be your next-door neighbor, their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their wives. I mean, there's a whole, gamut of things going on here, and it seems because this war has continued for as long as it has, for some people it seems like they've just forgotten that it's even going on, and that just can't happen.
That's exactly right. I think you're right. I think it's out of people's minds, and we need to put it, back in folks' minds, so that when, these individuals are coming back, these men and women are coming back, they aren't forgotten, as you said, a few minutes ago. I mean, that's the travesty, is if they're coming back and they aren't appreciated, we aren't doing everything we can to help them back into our communities.
Now, Mark, is there a website our listeners can find out more about the book and how to get it and things like that? Absolutely.
It's markleegreenblatt.com. So again, it's just my name, markleegreenblatt.com. And there's a very cool feature on there. I've set it up so that folks can go on, readers, your listeners can go on and email directly with the heroes, the men and women that we've been talking about today. Kyle Need, Buck Doyle, all the guys that we've that I profile, or their families, James Hassel's family that we talked about. Folks can go on there and email directly with them, share their thoughts, ask questions. Some folks just want to say thank you. And I know these, the men and women that I wrote about, or their families, would love to hear from people. They're very good, they're great people, and I'm sure they would love to chat with readers and your listeners. So that's a great feature. Again, it's markleegreenblatt.com, but there are also other things on the website, like pictures, of the ambush sites, or their, Kyle Need jumping into the water, and, all kinds of different pictures that will round out the stories a bit more.
Very good. Mark, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to dedicate yourself to be sure that these people here will be known and will be remembered the way they should be. And definitely a salute to you for doing that.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and let's hope that we spread the word on these stories and honor these heroes, and thank them as we should.
Absolutely. Mark, again, thank you for being on the program today.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, listeners, it's up to you out there. You can find out more. You can also visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. So in case you want to find out about these fascinating stories, which you should, then you want to maybe perhaps contact them directly through email, you should do that as well. Let them know that you're always going to be in support and behind them as well. We want to thank you for tuning in to the radio program today. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.